Hello and welcome to our session on Security Should Start Left, the problem with Shift Left. I have the pleasure in co-presenting with Aaron Ansari and myself, Ian Heritage. We're going to take you through what the real challenge is with Shift Left and some of the realities that we can focus on in starting that security journey with Starting Left. So I'm going to take you through, and we're both going to take you through this particular agenda. So first we're going to start off with the problem of Shift Left, developers and operations, Starting Left, and how you can continually raise the bar in security and build those innovative apps in the cloud, both securely and rapidly. Now the pressure is on to deliver business applications at lightning speed. We've seen over the pandemic, we're all moving on this digital journey, delivering apps for our customers and delivering apps to really fuel that business growth into the next few years and beyond. Now, if we look at my position of over the last number of years, I've been focused purely on operations. Now, we've all seen this problem. You wake up in the early hours of the morning and you've got some errors on your web pages. Your applications team are at you saying that things aren't working correctly. Now we know that if we move on, we know that these 404 pages and 503 pages are now graphical, and it's moved beyond just a problem with an internet page. We never want to see that site contains malware ahead, or that application is delivering malware maybe out to your customers. Beyond this, we look at our applications now, and there is a myriad of exposures and weaknesses that we now have to look at when we're looking at our applications. If we look at vulnerable components going from a developer right into runtime, you might have sensitive data exposure in S3 buckets that your applications or your customers are putting data in that you need to make sure are secured. And one of the biggest ones that we now know in the bottom right-hand corner is application misconfigurations, whether that being code that's being pushed into the developer pipeline, or whether it's a runtime configuration when particular services aren't configured quite correctly or are being misconfigured at that runtime. Now we're going to take you through some of these challenges and really focus in on that developer and operations persona. Now I'm going to hand over to Aaron now just to talk about the developer persona, and then I'll come in a bit later to talk about operations. So over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate it, and great introduction. We covered a lot of good things that we're going to talk about, and hopefully some relevant topics that our audience will resonate with, as well as maybe have some questions about. So, as Ian said, I'm Aaron, and I'm going to talk about the development side of things. And one of the favorite things that I had on the teams that I led and the groups in the development that I did was WOM, Works on My Machine, right? And that was a great acronym that we would use for when we were, fielding tickets, responding to troubles or incidents within production, or even in non-production environments. We'd say WOM, right? Works on my machine. And a more refined way to say this is, worked fine in development. So it's not development's problems anymore. And, the teams and the way that teams thought of things were, coding something, testing it or moving it to test, and then releasing it. And once you did that release, you kind of threw it over the wall. And, this build versus run versus maintain application sort of mentality is something that's tough to take into account, and is something that you have to accommodate with from a services standpoint for the way that you're building your application and the way that you're trying to maintain it. Because when you're doing things and you're building your application with the various services and the various environments that you're looking at, there's a lot of variability. Ian, you mentioned that configurations are something to look at. You mentioned that there are also the way that the application is being developed to look at. And these are things that take some time to understand, take some time to understand the commit and who's responsible for them, as well as take time for the teams to sort of get a level of expertise that they're comfortable with in order to work on and to work with the application teams as well as the operations teams to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to operations, Aaron, I think, when I was in this position, we all talked about stability. So making sure that that application was stable for a given period. But we know now that that stability over a given time, there's so many different variables in that as well. It has to be stable at a given traffic peak. It has to be stable in a given cloud environment. It has to be stable when working with different customers in different regions. Also scalability, the peaks and troughs. You look at Black Friday and the amount of traffic that goes into an e-commerce application at that given time. But when I speak about security, for me, from an operations standpoint, security was always embedded. It was more of a reactive scenario. We want to be in that preemptive or preventative scenario in when we're talking about security. When in operations positions, we know that from an infrastructure tools point of view, there is so much to balance and so much to look at. Whether you're looking at compute with EC2 and elastic environments there, whether you're looking at securing networking, and you know the types of networking involved in certain different microservices applications, whether you're looking at automation, so building in security with Systems Manager, or visibility, we want to make sure that all of these different tools are working for my side of the operations team, but also we really need to be focusing on security to prevent some of these challenges that we've seen happening out there in the wild, as it were. And I think, Aaron, you're going to talk a bit about the application, right, in terms of the focus of both development and operations.
Absolutely. And, when you look at the application, the key, I guess, focus is meant to be the customers, right? Who are going to be, or what we would call them, the end users, right? Who are going to be the end users of this application? And it's built off of the code that and the frameworks and the model that you're using to develop the application, as well as the infrastructure or the underlying pieces of, we'll say, configuration that are meant to house the code, right? And you think of the traditional OSI model. Obviously, that's different in cloud, but that premise of layer 1 through layer 7 with tier 8 kind of being the end user or the customer in this instance. And so application functionality, as it was designed and it was built, was core, right? That was kind of the number one thing that was being looked at. And as you sort of mentioned, security wasn't really the mindset here. It was to function. And so if you had a form and the form needed to take data, it didn't necessarily matter that the data form could take ticks or was susceptible to injection. That wasn't something that was necessarily on the developer's mindset, because the only thing that was there was functionality and end user service for the customer, right? And so as long as that customer was able to get the best use out of the application, that's what the developers were looking at, and that's how the application was built and coded. And when you look at the infrastructure component of that, really the development teams and my development teams were simply using the infrastructure just as a means to an end. There was no look at how the middleware was configured. There was no look at the services and the configuration pieces that were there. Now, as we start to deal, and we'll get to this later, with software-defined infrastructure and infrastructure as code, there was little, kind of mind that was put to that, as long as the functionality and the development was focused on the end result, which was, pleasing the customer or the end user.
Absolutely. And it all comes down to that, experience, right? And what are we saying here in terms of this?
In terms of this, the piece that keeps it all together is that experience. So when the end user is utilizing the application, be it in a production environment or, it will always be in a production environment, but be it in the environment that it was designed for. Perhaps it was a desktop or something that was meant to be consumed by a browser or in a mobile environment. Regardless of how it was designed, the experience is what we were going for from a development standpoint, right? So, there would be refinement and tweaks, but it was all about the experience.
Yeah. And I think completing that circle is all about entering that DevOps space where we can both, development and operations teams, can work together on the relevant processes, right? I think we've outlaid some of the key benefits of DevOps. We hear about DevOps all of the time. fast solutions, improved performance, increased efficiency, making sure that those teams are working to the delivered goal, which again, take that application. At the end of the day, it is the customer. And improving that customer experience, we want to make sure it's a great experience. And sometimes, in certain cases, where developers and operations teams aren't necessarily speaking to each other or don't have that feedback loop or not communicating correctly, then we're going to have some challenges there. And this is the key thing about DevOps is it's looking at reducing those failures and rollbacks in real time, but also those fast feedback loops are really furnishing the application and furnishing the delivery of that application as well. And when I think about, we talk about DevOps, right? And security across DevOps, some people would use the term DevSecOps. For me, security across DevOps is all about putting the security in place all over the pipeline and making sure that we're really looking into it. But I would call this a spanner, Aaron. You could probably call it a wrench, right? But
That's
the
correct.
Key thing here is that the key thing here is that sometimes just putting in security it is seen as an inhibitor sometimes. What do you think about that?
Well, very much so. And, I'm in agreement with you here on the term DevSecOps not really being something that necessarily needs to be defined. Security should simply be a part of DevOps. But as I said before, security as a consideration isn't necessarily the first thing on the mind of the development teams, right? Functionality is, usability is, right? And so that's why we're here, right? To talk about that problem with shifting left is, pushing security more and more and more from the security side to the developer side, right? And when you get and you put that into the cloud, right, it can't be just one team's responsibility. That has to be woven across all the environments and all the services that are being used. There are new roles and new titles and new positions. It's not just, cloud architects. There's site reliability engineers. There's, cloud and DevOps resources. There's people that are responsible for the infrastructure, right? Those people then commit and all have access to the code repository. Those people then look and have visibility into what's happening from a build pipeline perspective to understand where something's going from, a sandbox environment to staging to production, right? And when you have that level of input that's needed, what tends to happen is there's a lack of visibility in earlier stages of that pipeline, right? Especially when you're looking at a confined environment where it's just a sandbox or test sort of thing, and it's considered quote unquote local to that development team and to that development operations. And when we were building and managing teams, we would interact via tickets, right? And in certain instances, we do send tickets or create tickets or respond to tickets to people and teams that were, sitting, 3 meters away from us or very, very close to us, right? And it was just a great example of the lack of communication that was put between the teams that were sitting right next to each other. Obviously, it's a different world right now, but it sort of takes that adage of just passing the baton over the wall, right? You take this thing, you throw it over the wall, wipe your hands of it, not my problem. If it comes back to you in a ticket, you don't really interact with the team that's working on the other side of the ticket. You fix it, you throw it back over the wall, right? You build it in your non-production environment, you test it, works on my machine, and you throw it back over the wall. And obviously, my machine is your cloud environment that's built with hopefully the same services from an AWS standpoint that your production environment is built on. We won't get into cost of services and hosting and that sort of things in this discussion, but that was the mentality, and that is the mentality of a lot of development teams, especially in this high velocity, quick, constant and frequent release world, right? But what we need to go to,
and I think. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think when we come from an operations standpoint, I've always thought, it comes to operations, there's a problem with the code. That shift left mentality is actually, there might be a different way of doing this. And it's not just about that baton, right? It's not just about shifting testing left and shifting security left. And I think you were going to say something before I cut you off, but you were going to say something towards maybe this part here, right?
Almost like we practice this, right? And that's exactly right, right? Is that mentality and that visibility needs to come across the entire pipeline and across the entire process. And, I hinted to this. We've got technology that can help us do this with, cloud security posture management, config, GuardDuty, Macie. We can start naming services that do this, as well architected tools that are built into the framework that help do this. But then we've also, process and operational pieces that can work to help give that visibility across the entire release cycle, across the entire DevOps process, and across the entire build pipeline for this. And the last bit, I guess that I'll say, and again, I keep hinting at this, that we're going to talk about this, but that software-defined infrastructure as code, as long as you're building it with that visibility and with all teams in mind, really helps to sort of go to where we're heading with this topic of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it all starts with start left. It might be a very sort of high bar to get to, but for me, starting left is all about that collaboration, understanding, and engagement. And in today's world, we're not all going to get round that table and talk together. As you said, there are some common tools out there. There's, if you think of the communication methods that we're now all working towards and working with, it's that constant feedback and constant looping of all of that data that is giving both developers and operations that feedback that we really, really needed to create successful applications for our customers. And the thing when we talk about security and, we talk about starting left or shifting left, the common misconception is that to understand security, you really need to understand what risk is. Now, risk fundamentally has two different attitudes to how you can address risk, but let's just unpeel what risk actually is. Now, risk for me is all about identifying a problem. Now, not all risks can be identified very early on, but once you've identified a risk or understood a risk, there are really two things that can happen. The problem of that risk, the problem can be unwarranted and the event is going to be occurring now. If you dealt with that risk beforehand with preventative measures, say you were pushing something to code and you identified that maybe a code library or code repository had a library in it that was open source and was vulnerable, you could look at the developer providing those signals and maybe preventing that from going into runtime. Now, when we look at the alternative to risk, if we don't deal with it early on with prevention, we have to really look at the consequence. And the consequence is the result of that problem, the problem of that risk occurring. And with the consequence, this is where I talk about operations being very reactive. We have to be reaction-based to some things, and we have to have playbooks and operational manuals or operation handling procedures to deal with that. But the real key question here is that identifying and understanding risk, do you look at prevention or are you looking at reaction? And we were talking before, Aaron, about building control and how that might look over. And you talked about sort of a housing scenario or house scenario construction, building something from the ground up, and how building security controls and tests might, be a good common standard of starting left. So maybe you could talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, when you think about construction of an application, you can align that I'll say to the construction of a flat or a home, right? There are standards that you have to adhere to. There are pieces of the home that are prefabricated. There are inspections that are done, and there's visibility of the home that you're building, right? And so all of those pieces come together to build the flat. And that's exactly what we want to think of when we think of DevOps, when we think of application building, right? There are standards that you have to adhere to. There's a framework that you have to build off of, right? There's inspections and visibility that happens along the way. And eventually you get to the point where you release or build, kind of the end product. But there's maintenance that has to happen, right? And if you have the resources that were involved at the beginning and all the visibility that was there along the entire pipeline, it's much easier to do the maintenance and it's much easier to do the fixes when you've had that constant visibility as well as the proper foundation at the beginning. If you did something improper along the pipeline, or if you had some lack of visibility or something was done outside of your construct, right, or view, it's much more challenging in order to help fix and maintain that than if you had that from the very beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key thing with applications, you don't just build applications. Applications live, right? Once they're built, they live. And fundamentally, all of these different concepts, you might build onto that application, and that construction process begins again. And it's all about having those right tests, having the right security controls in place to make sure that that is being built securely and quickly as well. And oh, go on, Aaron.
Really, when you look at the build process, it's important to identify the foundational issues or pieces before it's put into production, right? And that's kind of one of the key points that we've been kind of circling around but haven't really driven on, is using the services and tools that are provided for you to be able to do that and build off of that solid foundation, right? And I mentioned a few that are part or given to you as part of your AWS subscription, right? You can use the well-architected tool. You can use various services that help you kind of build that environment correctly, right? You can also use those services because they have a security component built within their mindset, as well as various functionalities of those services in order to architect your application correctly, right? So if you're using a serverless function, if you're using storage or compute, those functions that are provided to you by AWS already have a level of visibility and a level of service that's given as part of their nature and their function, which is fantastic. You just have to know how to use them correctly, and you have to know how to put that visibility in the right spot, right? And this is kind of where that framework comes into play, where you're using the pieces that were built by somebody else, right? The lumber or something else, and you're kind of constructing it all. But you trust in that lumber, and you trust in that concrete that was provided for you. You trust in EKS, you trust in EC2, you trust in the serverless functions, and you build those and construct those together to kind of form and be on top of that foundation. And you know that they're going to be in a secure manner, and you know that they're going to be given to the visibility of the entire team.
Exactly. And I think it's all about getting those right signals, right? If you just look at the bottom here, from a developer point of view, do you test and fix all of your code? Do you have the ability to run scans on your pipelines and code repositories? But when we shift into that operations view, where everything, like you said before, you talked about it, is infrastructure as code, it's being pushed to that operations view. Now, operations don't necessarily want to affect anything in production. So I would say that the detection and notification of problems early on is absolutely key. And then once you build up a picture of that, you can look at detection and prevention to really look at how you might respond to security incidents within that production infrastructure. But also we know that common concepts of different tooling, there's no one tool that can fix everything in that DevSecOps or developer operations platform. And for me, the starting left really comes into its own here when we get that collaboration, when we get everyone around the table to start talking about the sensors that we might be putting in, the controls that we might be putting in place, and the processes. Because once you can start putting all of those processes in place, both at the developer runtime, the developer sort of ecosystem with the tools that you've mentioned previously, and then the operations side, you could really look at this whole prevent, detect, and respond. And whether it's the operations team who need to respond to it, or whether it's the development that needs to respond to it, I think the core concept, and you might be able to speak about this a bit more, Aaron, is the visibility and the posture monitoring of the whole environment, because I think that's really important to understand, right?
That's right. And let's go back to our housing analogy, right? If you've got something wrong, you could have a generalist come over and say, kind of looks like a plumbing thing, right? That generalist has the visibility and to see what's happening. That generalist has the expertise to know, I see that there's a problem, I've identified that there's a problem, and you need somebody specific to fix it. And then that generalist has the ability to call in and communicate with the plumber to come fix things, right? So let's take this in a build analogy, right? You can have an operations person come in as a site reliability engineer, or somebody that's maybe a cloud architect, right? That can come in and say, ooh, there's something wrong with the service that's built that this application is built off of, and I think this is the problem. Let me go to the development team and figure out what we need to do. And the DevOps resources comes in, and they work and they collaborate together in order to fix the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the right, I would say with that, you need to be communicating at that level. You talked about it earlier, right? We all have that visibility reduces further left. And by putting all of these toolings in right from the start and making sure that feedback loop is providing relevant feedback to the relevant teams is absolutely key here. And you might want to talk about some of how we might want to automate some of that as well. So building in visibility.
That's exactly right. Right. So we're here at reInvent, right? AWS gives you a fantastic foundation to build off of, right? And understanding the shared responsibility model isn't a part of this presentation, but if you don't understand it, do some homework as you're going through and doing this. But we've talked about the services that are available for you, some new ones of which that have just been announced here at reInvent, that you should be using, right? And you should be configuring and utilizing in order to give that visibility so that you are starting off of the best foundation possible. And when you build in the proper configuration of the services, when you're using a software-defined infrastructure, when you're using, let's say an AWS CloudFormation template that's new, that's built off the proper services, that has the right pieces of the functionality that you need, you're kind of piecing and parting it all together. You've built that template. You're able to use that template to hang the application framework off of, right? And then you've got the proper configuration, the proper identity and access management, the proper services that are meant to be there, the proper encryption, the proper key management, and all that functionality, right? That's provided to you that you're able to sort of recipe together. Remember, we're using the house building analogy, right? That you're able to construct together to make something a key success, right? And when you have that, you're able to then stamp that environment over and over and over again to build the next house or to build the next application, right? And you update it. Maybe there's a new code. Going back to that house analogy, maybe there's some new technology that's put into the local build code that says no, now houses must have this much efficient air conditioner or this much efficient sort of electricity. Maybe there's a new service that's provided by AWS that says no, now you've got to have this level of key access rotation, or no, there's a new identity and access management functionality here that you must utilize, or you should utilize from a best practices standpoint, and you update that CloudFormation template and you utilize that for the next build cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you talked about automating visibility. So maybe, once every account is built in, then we want to make sure that, we've got visibility of that. But how about actually building in protection as well to that infrastructure? You talk about that house analogy. I love that. We want to put in the right fire controls. We want to put in the right regulations for maybe CCTV or something like that. But the benefits that we have in automating control by leveraging something like AWS Control Tower, making sure that we can build in those EC2 instances with workload protection. So we've got those security blankets around that control, and making sure that all of those feedback loops are really, really working for both the operations team and also the developers with some of the other controls in there as well. Now, we've always talked about continually raising the bar. I think we were just going to summarize with some of the key things that you'd like to take away from this reInvent. I know there's been lots of different services, lots of different things to take away, and I've really enjoyed the sessions as well. But Aaron, maybe we can just signal how customers, users out there of cloud services can really look at some of what we've talked about in Starting Left today.
Certainly, and it comes back to two very basic things, right? communication and visibility, and those kind of go together, right? And I'll throw automation as a half component there, right? When you're able to communicate across the pipeline, when you're able to have the visibility through that communication, because the teams and the resources are collaborating, and you're using the technologies that are provided for you to give you that communication and that visibility, you're able to really build foundational success, one model after the other, after the other, after the other. And as we've mentioned, there are many, many pieces of the framework that are given and provided to you as part of your AWS subscription, right? So be it the well-architected tool, be it guard duty, be it control tower, be it config, right? Anything that's already there should be utilized as part of some of the functionality that's your responsibility from the understanding of that shared responsibility model. And that's your foundation, right? That's sort of where you start. But you then have your plan, and you hang your application framework off of that. You build off of the best practices that are provided for you. You layer over the policies and the pieces that give you the best practice from a system and compliance perspective, and then you kind of take the best practice expertise from others outside of your organization that are there to sort of tell you what's what, how you should be doing things, and give you some more visibility into perhaps outside of just your business or just your industry vertical to say and understand what threats and other attacks are coming. But the key to all of this is that you have visibility and you have communication, and you have that along the entire process of your application pipeline.
Yeah, I absolutely love this preparing for the future part. Is hopefully this is something that people can take away, they can build on. I look at the well-architected review, the well-architected framework all of the time, the white papers, the CAFs, the cloud adoption frameworks that are out there, because they are a great signaling post to go back to and keep looking at how you can build those applications better in the cloud. And I think for me, systems over people is absolutely key. Making sure that things like patching, at the end of the day, we want to be making sure that we identify vulnerabilities in our code very early on before it even needs to be patched, right? So the key concepts there is, do you have the right systems in place, not just relying on people, but almost augmenting their experience and augmenting what they can really deliver for customers. And that observe and react is to make sure that you're looking at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We've just seen that the MITRE ATT&CK team have released some cloud-specific parts, even for containers, things like that, right? OWASP top 10, right? The OWASP top 10 model does not change from year on year. Pretty much, we know that SQL...
It was just updated for 2021, yeah.
But I mean that the SQL injection is still at the top, right?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Is it second?
It was just reshuffled.
Yeah, exactly, they're ordering. But we know that those attackers are maybe using those common techniques and tactics out there. And this is why, I could talk about attack framework all day, but understanding the adversaries and trying to understand what they're trying to do, not just in your enterprise, but in cloud environments, because once we start to observe and react, we're able to be a lot more vigilant and practice some of those techniques and practices in those given scenarios. I thought I'd just give you some, 3 highlights as a summary to take away. Hopefully in this session, we've provided you how including security and DevOps from the start is going to be absolutely key in making sure that you can produce those applications at lightning speed and make sure that you're delivering satisfaction to your customers throughout your journey in the cloud. Also, adapting existing processes for prevention and reaction. We talked about risk, right? Do you want to be that preventative person, or do you want to be the reactive person? Now, some of that balance is going to be absolutely key in how you understand the risk in your environments. And also integrations. We've talked about integrations with the common tools, such as Systems Manager, such as Account Factory, Control Tower, and things like that. And the integration and tooling can be different. It doesn't have to be the same across your blueprints, across that infrastructure. I love the housing analogy. We could go back to how different houses are built in different ways, but the security tooling maybe is different because you've built the construction in a bit of a different way. Maybe you're using containers, maybe you're using Lambda, maybe you're using serverless in certain instances. But I think, Aaron, if you agree that the tooling is absolutely key, but making sure that that's brought together from understanding how we start left as opposed to just blaming and shifting that baton to shift left because we're reacting to some of these problems all of the time.
100%. Complete agreement. And, having that as part of the beginning or the genesis of the way that teams build, fundamental to security.
Perfect. Well, for me, I thank you for your time today. I hope you have a great rest of reInvent, and we look forward to seeing you again next year.
Take care.